Welcome back to an exploration of Eno Juhani Rautavaara's Third Symphony and a look at the influence of Bruckner on the work. In the last episode, we covered the first two movements of Rautavaara's Third and established the two 12-tone matrices that inform the melodic and ornamental content of the work. In this episode, we will look at the final two movements, as well as the influence that the symphony has had on future composers. For this episode, I'll be assuming you have an understanding of the original series and fifth series that Rautavaara uses in his third, and a knowledge of the themes already presented in the first two movements. If this is already confusing to you, then please go back and watch the first episode. To understand the themes of the third movement, we must understand the concept of developing variations first. Schoenberg coined the term developing variations to describe constant modification of motives and ideas in a theme or even throughout an entire work, thereby essentially removing the recapitulation. Using this technique makes sense for Rautavaara, who said, quote, "For me, the recapitulation was an anticlimax. It was too predictable to be anything but disappointing." Instead of recapitulating, Rautavaara's repeated ideas are always in transformation, pressing on through time. We saw proof of this when we looked at the form of the second movement, but is also crucial to understanding the third movement. When we looked at the second movement, we saw proof of developing variations on the microscale, or how Rautavaara organizes and develops his themes within a single movement. Now that we turn to the third movement, we will see proof of this microscale once more, but now I will also demonstrate developing variations on the macroscale by showing how the themes of the third movement develop out of the themes of the first two, which of course all go back to the two 12-tone series that make up the entire work. The remarkable aspect of Rautavaara's third is that almost every musical idea derives from two different 12-tone rows while constantly developing rather than exactly repeating or recapitulating. The third movement centers around two main ideas, the first being this rollicking primary theme in C sharp. And the second being the skittering feel that darts around in woodwinds and strings. You may have already noticed a similarity to the first movement, which is the same two types of ideas that switches between melodic content and rapid chromatic ornamental lines. The similarities don't end in vibes, however, as these two ideas in the third movement are actually a modification of the two ideas in the first movement, thereby showing an example of macro-developing variations across the entire symphony. Just like the first movement, the primary theme derives from the original tone row, and the darting chromatic feel comes from the fifth series tone row, although Rautavaara is certainly more liberal in his serialism in the third movement, repeating tones and sometimes not fully completing the tone row. The primary theme is P8 of the original series, but it doesn't fully state the row until after a few repetitions and very slightly repeats at the very end. P8 is as shown, and here's how it sounds without rhythm. Now look at the tail end of the primary theme after the first two repetitions, and you will see the P8 row. When I play the theme again, listen for the P8 row. The primary theme for the third movement, then, is the same tone row as the theme of the first movement, only in a different transposition and rhythm. The similarity can also be seen in that both themes are based on open fifths. If the primary theme of the third movement is based on the original series, then it should be no surprise that the secondary skittering idea comes from the fifth series, just like in the first movement. The first statement of the skittering idea is I8 of the fifth series matrix, broken up between flute and clarinet, and albeit with many repeated notes. I8 of the fifth series is as shown, and here's how it sounds without rhythm. Now listen for I8 in the skittering chromatic line in flute and oboe. This fifth series derived skittering section has an electric energy that appropriately culminates on a large G-sharp chord, the dominant of the primary theme, to lead us to the full realization of the primary theme. This structure again recalls the first movement and, of course, Bruckner's use of teleological genesis in his symphonies. I'm going to start on the skittering section and listen for the final dominant that then leads us back to the primary theme. After this, the music proceeds in the same way as the opening, but this time the skittering section results in a deceptive cadence, using chromaticism to transition to E-flat and an entirely new section and idea of the movement, rather than restating the primary theme in C-sharp. I'm going to play the music starting with the second iteration of the primary theme into the B section, and this time listen for the deceptive cadence. This new section quickly leads into a development of the primary theme, now in a different transposition, inverted, and in counterpoint with itself between clarinet and flute, thereby proving the idea of developing variations on the micro level within the movement. Naturally, this development of the primary theme is I4 on the tone row of the original series matrix. Here is what I4 sounds like without rhythm. And here is the developed theme in the symphony. Once again, listen for those pitches from the tone row. After some transition material, we return back to the skittering material, which is now developed by having a new melody in brass added on top of the texture. This brass statement is a perfect, concise statement of the intention of the entire symphony, that of synthesizing Romanticism and modernism. The brass is very Brucknerian in its loud and triumphant homophony and through the use of Wagner tubas. But it is also modern, as it is a statement of the P3 original series tone row. It is a truncated statement that does not complete the entire tone row, but the melody is an exact statement of the first four notes and is in the same rhythm and placement as the opening theme of the entire symphony. Listen to the opening theme of the first movement, which is P9 and played by the French horn. And now listen to the melody in the brass statement in the third movement, which is P3 and played by first trumpet and trombone. While it ends prematurely, is transposed, more fully orchestrated, and with different harmony than the theme from the first movement, it is otherwise exactly the same, and the similarity is rather striking. The harmony within the theme itself then further develops the row. The second trumpet line is a retrograde statement of the first trumpet line. It doesn't work when looking at the expanded R3, but if you only consider the four notes of P3 that the melody in the first trumpet states, then the second trumpet line can be seen as a retrograde of that small four-note cell taken from the P3 row. What's interesting about this theme in the third movement, in terms of developing variations, is that this is simultaneously a development and the generating theme. It is a development of the primary theme in this third movement, but that in of itself is a development of the primary theme of the first movement, which is what this development within the context of the third movement is. That's confusing to explain, and the classifications don't really matter, other than to show how interconnected all of Rautavaara's ideas are, and how his use of developing variations applies to both the individual movement and to the symphony as a whole. Lastly, the skittering woodwinds that this brass line is placed over is, of course, derivative from the fifth series tone row matrix. The woodwind line repeats notes and is truncated, but is a constant repetition of P0 of the fifth series. If we start on G and only continue to D flat and repeat this over and over and over, the P0 series sounds like this. Now, when I play the brass melody over the skittering woodwinds, ignore the melody and listen for the P0 series in the ornamental woodwind line. After a brief development of the skittering idea that adds dramatic timpani, the cello introduces a familiar motif from a previous movement in the symphony underneath a rising violin melody. When I play this section, see if you can recognize where the cello motif is from. This music material, new to the third movement, is actually a development of a theme from the second movement. If you remember from the last episode, this rhythmic oscillating quaver idea is central to the second movement, and the use of rhythmic structure is another relation to Bruckner. For a quick reminder, here's the initial presentation of the oscillating quaver idea in the second movement. This initial presentation is oscillating on a minor third, whereas the example from the third movement is on a minor second. The first fortissimo culmination of the second movement, however, sounds very similar to the third movement, with both ideas being based on a minor second. Here is the first fortissimo culmination from the second movement. And here is the same oscillating quaver, now in the cello line, from the third movement. After the primary theme of the third movement is passed around rapidly in variations, we have a variation on the quaver idea again, now more fleshed out and articulated in French horns. As can be seen through the third movement's use of primary themes and ideas from both movements preceding it, Rautavaara's third makes use of developing variations across the entire symphony. The symphony concludes by the quavering idea then leading us back to final statements and variations of the primary theme before culminating in a grand climax. We unfortunately do not have the time to go as in depth on the fourth movement as we did on the third, but a few brief observations should still be made. Towards the end of the fourth movement, we are rewarded with a big brassy climax that sounds like this. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is the same theme as the fortissimo culmination from the second movement, only now angrier with slightly different orchestration. Listen to the two back to back and notice the striking similarities. Here is the climax of the second movement. And here is the climax of the fourth movement. The movement then ends on a triumphant major conclusion, a seemingly fitting ending for a symphony. Instead of ending here, however, Rautavaara returns to the exact same music that opened the symphony, even being in the same key. But even still, Rautavaara is not giving us a recapitulation or a repeat, as the French horn line is another variation of the original theme, thereby continuing the concept of developing variations until the very last note in the symphony. Now we will look beyond the Third Symphony to see the lasting effect the work has had on both Rautavaara and others. Rautavaara's Third was written in 1960, and we can jump forward 18 years to 1978 with his tone poem Angels and Visitations to find a quote from the Third Symphony. The conclusion of Angels and Visitations quotes the big brass conclusion at the end of the Third Symphony. For a quick reminder, here's the brass conclusion at the end of Movement 4 of Symphony No. 3. And this is the brass conclusion at the end of Angels and Visitations. As Burton writes in his dissertation on the music of Rautavaara, quote, The section in Angels and Visitations is actually reharmonized and some of the notes are changed, most notably the new chromatic clashes in bars 314 and 318. These alterations significantly contribute to the changed atmosphere of this closing extract, making it less optimistic than the earlier symphony. Furthermore, this new context adds a coloristic harmonic expression achieved through the chromaticism to the row from which this quotation derives in the Third Symphony, undermining the triadic serialism of the earlier work. Even in a new piece 18 years later, Rautavaara is continuing to develop his material. Finally, we jump forward into the present day, where we continue to see the influence of Rautavaara's Third Symphony. Finnish composer Magnus Lindberg, who unsurprisingly studied with Rautavaara, was heavily influenced by Rautavaara. While most of the similarities that the oeuvres of Lindberg and Rautavaara share can be drawn back to Sibelius, a moment in Lindberg's 2017 piece Tempus Fugit very strongly evokes Rautavaara's Third with a Brucknerian tinge. The specific moment from Tempus Fugit is at the climax of the third movement and sounds as follows. This sounds and feels strikingly similar to the first climax from the first movement of Rautavaara's Third, which is as follows. Writing about Tempus Fugit, Burton says, quote, "Although there are 5 broad sections, the music unfolds continuously, making it deliberately difficult to maintain awareness of the beginning and end of individual sections. The gradual circular orientation towards a short motif in the third movement recalls the large expressive gestures in Rautavaara's Third Symphony that transform focused motivic material. As the symphony looks to a Brucknerian model, there seems to be a broader inclination towards large waves of orchestral material." An oversimplification of the historical position of Rautavaara's Third Symphony would be to call it a synthesis of Bruckner and Berg. Then, with Rautavaara's later works, the works of Lindberg, and who knows who else, the Third Symphony is now the point of inspiration in the continued historical progression of classical music. There is always more to be said, and I'd encourage the curious viewer to spend more time on the first and fourth movements of the Third Symphony, as I did not spend much time on them. But unfortunately, that is all I have for now on the wonderful work of Eino Juhani Rautavaara.